Yeah, I'm about. Well, I hope you're doing well this evening. And as we come together to uh, have our evening Bible study, if you want to turn to Ezra chapter 1, the first verse in that will be a reference for tonight to some degree. And so uh, that'll give you a jumping off point from where we'll be at tonight as we look um, at the text for tonight for the timeline of the Bible. We're going to start off with taking your prayer concerns, and I'm going to share with you while you're turning to Ezra chapter 1, I was going to tell you that I went to go eat lunch with my mom and dad after the service today. They came to hear about our mission trip to Vermont, and while we were eating lunch, as soon as I sat down, my dad told me, he said, "Son, you're starting to get above your raisin." And I was like, "Okay." I said, I'm thinking, I ain't seen him in a week. What's this about? And so we're sitting down there, and he said, "You're getting above your raisin." I said, "Okay." And I sort of looked past him at my mom, and I saw her starting to smirk. So I knew this was going to be humorous, whatever it was. And so Dad told me, he said, "Yeah," he said, "everybody knows that the hymn you sing after communion is 'Blessed be the tie that binds.'" He said, "You got it wrong today." And I said, "Okay." I said, "All right." I said, "I'll remember that for next time." So, but no, he was aggravating me about that. There you go. I appreciate that. Well, tonight we are, if you haven't got a copy of the timeline, there's some at the back banisters. Be sure to get one to follow along with. And tonight we are past the exile, and now we are looking at the return to Jerusalem of the Jews. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the return to Jerusalem, and the time period for this particular section in the timeline. Did I put those in the wrong order, Daryl? The time is actually 537, as you see there on your handouts. This is from 537 BC to 400 BC. And so the time period ends, or begins, I guess I should say, at the declaration of King Cyrus of Persia that we talked about last time we were together, where he decreed, and it's recorded on that clay cylinder, that basically people groups that had been relocated because of King Nebuchadnezzar and other Babylonian kings could now return to their homelands. And so we know that in 537 BC, he opened that up for the Jews to return to the region of Judea and Jerusalem. Now, the text that we're going to be looking at or discussing at length tonight is really 6 books of the Bible. You're talking about Haggai, Zechariah, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Malachi. And so we have a wide range of dates and times for these events to happen. And you see on your handout there, if you have one in front of you, that Zechariah and Haggai are at the very beginning of the time period that we're looking at. And then Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah sort of start the middle towards the end, and then Malachi is wrapping it up at the end. And so we'll talk about all of this tonight as we go through. Now, as always, we're talking about specific events happening in the timeline during this period of time, this 137 years on the timeline. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the actual return to Jerusalem, because there was a start to this, and it occurred, as we know, in 537 BC. Well, here is the interesting thing. You don't have to turn there, but you may want to jot this scripture reference down in your notes on the back side of your timeline or something like that. But in Isaiah 44, verse 28, Isaiah 44, verse 28, what we find is some words written by the prophet Isaiah during his prophetic ministry, and this is what it says. It says, "It is I," talking about God, "it is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be rebuilt, and of the temple your foundation will be laid." The interesting thing is Isaiah is writing this 150 years before Cyrus made his declaration, at least 150 years before Cyrus made the declaration for the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And so we see that God is speaking through the prophet Isaiah, calling Cyrus by name nonetheless. And so the Jews end up going into captivity, and Cyrus sends them home, and it's all been prophesied in the book of Isaiah. Now, in 537, as we said, Cyrus the Great is the name of the Persian king. According to Ezra 1 and extra biblical sources, tell us that Cyrus released the Jews to return to their homeland of Israel, or Judah, or Judea, however you want to call it. But many Jews, as recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah, they begin to return to Jerusalem. There was two big waves, I guess you would call it, one with Ezra and one with Nehemiah, where there were large groups because they would have been under the protection of the king traveling with Ezra and Nehemiah. So there's these large groups that are traveling, but during that first wave of Jews that went back to Jerusalem, there were two prophets that would be used by God to help lead the people during this time. Ezra the scribe would have been one that would eventually be a big leader, as would Nehemiah. But early on, as is recorded in Ezra, or supported in Ezra, I guess I should say, we find that Haggai and Zechariah are the two prophets that go back and are really leading the movement forward in Jerusalem, specifically the rebuilding of the temple. But not only that, we see that during the prophetic ministries of these two men, as you see there on your handout or on the timeline, not only did the reconstruction of the temple begin under their ministry, but also the real reconstruction of Jerusalem occurred, at least began under their watch. And so we see that the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem are starting around this time. Because remember, Nebuchadnezzar came in and he basically razed it to the ground. I mean, he just basically tore everything down, burnt the temple down, burnt Jerusalem down, and just destroyed everything. So there was really nothing in Jerusalem for 50, 60 years that, or at this point, 50 years. There was nothing in Jerusalem that was viable for people to live or to use. And so this is a complete rebuilding from the ground up, using old stones and starting over. And so we see that the rebuilding of the temple is beginning, and the Jews, when they get back to Jerusalem in 537 BC or thereabouts, they start with the rebuilding process as King Cyrus has decreed. And so they were initially more concerned with rebuilding the temple than they were their own houses in the city of Jerusalem. That was their initial, focus, tunnel vision, whatever you want to call it. We got to get the temple rebuilt. And so they started that, and it didn't take long for them to realize the magnitude of the task at hand. And all of a sudden, their focus flip-flopped. Instead of being focused on the temple and less focused on home, they were more focused on home than they were on the temple. And so that's what ends up happening. And they become busy and focused on building their homes and building their lives and building something for the future in Jerusalem instead of building the temple. And so what happened was they got to the point, as you see there on your handout, all the way to the left in 537 BC, the altar is built for the second temple, but then all work ceases. So they'd got the altar started, so they could still have worship to some degree because they had the place for the sacrifices, but that was about it. It was almost like we'll get the bare minimum done, and then we'll work on it later. That kind of a mentality. But with the temple, it remained unfinished, and there were no construction efforts from 537 to 520. So for 17 years, they basically just had the altar there and didn't have the temple structure, the foundation, or anything prepared. And interestingly, I found a timeline online that gave me the exact dates of this and the scripture references for it. In Haggai 1:1, it tells us that basically on August the 29th of 520 BC, there was a call by Haggai to resume building, and the leaders in Jerusalem followed the vision, followed through with what he wanted them to do, and they began making plans to rebuild the temple or to continue in rebuilding the temple. And then on September 21st, as we read in Haggai 2:1, that work in September 21st, that work started on the reconstruction of the temple. And I apologize, I looked at the wrong scripture reference. That's actually in Haggai 1:15. So in a matter of about 3 weeks, they went from Haggai saying, we've got to get our act together and start building the temple back, So 3 weeks later, they're starting to dig foundation area and get everything squared away. And then we find out from Haggai 2:1 that some were not impressed with the new building's potential size compared to the Temple of Solomon. And, they were discouraged by that. And so on October 17th of 520 BC, Haggai gave another message encouraging the people in Jerusalem to not to look to the past, but to move forward, doing what God had called them to do. And then finally, more than 3 months from the beginning of this process with Haggai, on December 18th of that year, the foundation was ready to be laid, and there was this big to-do. It was a big party, a big celebration for the beginning of the foundation of the temple, and Haggai and Zechariah both spoke at this celebration. And so this was in 520 BC, and depending on what calendar you use and one thing and another, some people say that the temple was completed in 515, some say 516 BC, but it was basically a 4 to 5 year project, depending on the Jewish calendar and a lot of things that are a big headache to try and sort out. So nevertheless, it took about 4 to 5 years for them to be able to rebuild the temple. And it was nowhere near, this is called the second temple, or the temple of Zerubbabel, but it didn't hold a candle in size and grandeur to the Temple of Solomon. Because remember, when we look in the Chronicles and Kings, and it's talking about the development of the construction of the Temple of Solomon. Doors are gold plated and there's silver, everywhere, and so this was not that kind of structure. But nevertheless, they rebuilt the temple, and it was basically completed and able to be used for worship in 516, 515 BC. But in addition to this, they also had to begin the process of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, which, when we think of rebuilding the city, we're thinking about making sure that the wells are functioning and the aqueducts are moving water, and we think about the streets and buildings that have collapsed and been destroyed, cleaning them out. But primarily, when it's described as the rebuilding of the city, typically it's a reference to the rebuilding of the wall, because that was what made the city. That's what made it a city, was not just the people in it, but that wall made it a city that gave them protection and gave them what they needed. And so when we say rebuilding of Jerusalem, we do mean the city itself, but there's a lot of talk about the wall as well. So when that first group of exiles came back with the decree from Cyrus in 537 BC, they no doubt started rebuilding the city and rebuilding the walls to some degree, their homes and the infrastructure and all of those things. There was a concerted effort that coincided with the rebuilding of the temple, though. You see that in the timeline there. Excuse me. That just after the temple was started to be reconstructed, the people really started the reconstruction of the city as well. And so they were sort of working on both of them for a few years there, but then the city took a lot longer than the temple to be rebuilt. And so they had to work on it for quite a long time. And so from 519 BC, when they started rebuilding the city and the infrastructure and the wall and all that, for the next 62 years, they continued rebuilding the city, and a second group of exiles returned under the direction of the scribe Ezra in 457 BC. And so you see in the midst of the reconstruction efforts that Ezra arrives around 457 BC and brings with him a group of exiles that we read about in the book of Ezra. And interestingly, he reorganized the government of Judea to basically not to usurp Persian rule, but under his governmental rule as governor, so to speak, if you want to call it that, he got them under Jewish law. He got them back to practicing the law of Moses, so that they would follow God's law like they should. Because being a scribe, that was one of his responsibilities. But from 457, when he arrives with this second group of exiles, until 444 444 BC. The wall was worked on, but there was nothing significant as far as a major organized effort until the final year, 444 BC. And the reason for that is Nehemiah. Nehemiah shows up. Ezra has been in town for 13 years, keeping the worship in the temple going, keeping Judea, running like it should under the law of Moses. And so Nehemiah shows up and becomes the governor and is a very godly man, but also a great administrator. And so he goes to Jerusalem to oversee the rebuilding effort of the wall. As we read, he's burdened by this, and the king says, what's bothering you? And well, let me take care of that for you. And so, interestingly, Nehemiah was able to bring the rebuilding of the wall to completion in 52 days. They've been working on it for 62 years, and he got it done in 52 days. That is the kind of manager or leader you want in your business, right? Somebody that's going to step in and be like, you guys have been dawdling way too long. Let's take care of business and let's get this done. And that's what he really did. I mean, it was a matter of just a matter of weeks, and the wall was completed. And so the wall is completed. So this is the major elements for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the return to Jerusalem, is the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the city. And Nehemiah comes in and basically just in a whirlwind gets everything done. Well, another one of the major events that occurs during this time, the time of the return to Jerusalem, up until 400 BC, is Haman's attempt to exterminate the Jews. Now think about this. 30 years, as you see it there on your handout, 30 years before the city of Jerusalem is completed, or the wall around Jerusalem is completed, Haman, the Persian government official under Xerxes I, was offended by this Jew named Mordecai. And he's offended because he doesn't like Mordecai to begin with, but then Mordecai doesn't bow down to him in the capital city of Susa. And because of this offense, Haman begins this big, drawn-out process. He's conceiving this plan that is kind of treacherous to the king anyway, and plans to have all of the Jews destroyed through this edict that he gets the king to agree to. And the catch is, it's going to kill or eradicate every Jew in the Persian Empire. Now, here is the thing. There were probably almost no Jews living outside of the Persian Empire at the time frame of 474 BC. They probably all were under Persian rule. So this would have been genocide on a tremendous level. And so the size of the empire of Persia in Haman's day, it covered an estimated 2.1 million square miles. And it included all or part of the following countries: Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Armenia, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Greece, and Bulgaria. So think about this. This is a massive, actually it was the largest ancient kingdom until the Romans came along. And so the Persians they controlled everything from Greece to India. I mean, that's if you think about a map, that is what that is. It's everything from the very edge of Greece. They controlled a little bit of Macedonia or Greece, all the way to what we know to be the India border today. And so they had millions and millions of subjects, and a lot of those were Jews. And had Haman's his edict, that he worked through with the king, had his genocide plan worked, it would have eradicated the Jewish people in 474 BC. It would. I mean, we always think about, they sent this letter out to a couple of cities, and it's going to. No, this is like millions of people probably across a large swath of what we know to be the Middle East and Asia. And so we read in the book of Esther, though, how Mordecai, his niece Esther, is chosen to be queen after Vashti gets herself in trouble and is no longer the queen, and Esther is encouraged by Mordecai to approach the king about trying to save the Jewish people. And Esther uses her audience with the king to eventually bring Haman's plan to light. And Haman's plan set in place was set in place by a royal decree that couldn't be undone. And so the only thing that could be done was another royal decree given to basically give the Jews the opportunity to protect themselves against anybody that followed through with the plan to try and eradicate them. And as we know, the Jews survived this very dire situation and actually came out the better in some situations. But through this also, we know that Mordecai, because of his loyalty to the king and what he had done to uncover an assassination plot earlier, is honored after this situation. And ironies of ironies, Haman builds gallows to hang Mordecai on, and instead Haman is hung on them instead of Mordecai. And so we know that that is, a major turning point. And as I told you last time that we were together looking at the timeline, I had always put that in the exile time period. For some reason, for me, I'd always just sort of, that had to have happened in that time period. And it's interesting when you start looking at the timelines of the kings of Persia and not just that, but Esther, it all pulls together and shows us a great layout of the timeline and how God used it. Now, the final event that happens during this time period is the end of Old Testament prophecy as we know it. Following the rebuilding of Jerusalem in 444 BC, God spoke through the last Old Testament prophet around 400 BC. And Malachi, or Malachi for our Italian friends. Yeah, make sure you're still awake. My uncle told me that years ago, and I use it like almost every time I say Malachi. I'm sorry. And I'm telling you, I know I'm bad to tell bad dad jokes, but Patsy said yes. That if you want someone who gives even better dad jokes than me, talk to Savannah's son, Caden. He and I had a bad dad joke battle on the way back from Vermont, and that kid can hang, I'll tell you. He can hold his own. So we had a lot of fun with that. So be sure to ask Caden to tell you a bad dad joke. But nevertheless, Malachi is the last prophet that God used to speak to Israel during the Old Testament days. And we're not exactly sure of the exact time of Malachi's ministry as a prophet. And there's even some people, I didn't know this till I was preparing for tonight, that there's some people that believe that Ezra used Malachi as a, what do you call it, pseudonym? No, that's not the right name, is it? Where you write under somebody else's name, a pseudonym. A ghostwriter, however you want to look at it, a pseudonym, ghostwriter, that sort of thing. Some believe that Ezra used the name of Malachi to write the prophecies there. I don't tend to believe that, mostly because Ezra was a scribe and God used him specifically, and that was he knew, you can tell from reading Ezra that he knew his role as a scribe, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Malachi is a prophet doing something completely different than a scribe, and so I don't subscribe to that theory that Malachi was Ezra. But again, we can't pinpoint Malachi's prophecy or prophetic ministry to a particular time. But there's some that date it to 440, to 420, or even 400 BC. What we know is that it was most likely 400 BC or earlier. So it was probably 400 to 440 BC. Somewhere in there, Malachi writes and is the last Old Testament prophet that God speaks through. And following the prophecies of Malachi that we read of at the end of the Old Testament, God is silent through the prophets for 400 years. He doesn't speak again until he speaks in 25 AD, roughly, through the man that we know to be John the Baptist. John is the last Old Testament prophet and the first New Testament prophet, is typically how he is viewed. And so we know that this 400 BC time period is the end of the Old Testament prophecy. And so outside of the events that we've talked about, we also want to talk about the people that, a few of the people that are involved here. One is Ezra that I mentioned just a moment ago. We know that he was born in exile, and he ends up returning to Jerusalem in 457 BC. We know that he was a scribe, which means that he was responsible for a couple of things. He was responsible for transcribing, hence the word scribe. He was responsible for transcribing the Old Testament law and making more copies. So one of his responsibilities was as a printing press. He's just writing and copying the scriptures, and that gave him a very firm understanding of the Old Testament law. So when it came time to implement the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law in Jerusalem after the king sends him back, he goes and he has a solid understanding of it. So he's able to do that and set up the governmental law according to the law of Moses. But in addition to being a scribe and transcribing, he would have also been a teacher, basically one who would explain the law to the people. And so he would do those sort of things. As I said, he reorganized that governmental structure in Judea. But Ezra was in Jerusalem when Nehemiah returns comes to Jerusalem as the governor and was tasked with rebuilding the wall. And at the celebration commemorating the completion of the wall around Jerusalem, we know that Ezra famously reads the entire law of Moses while the people of Jerusalem stood there and listened to him. And we know that Ezra died around 421 BC. And there are different traditions that place his burial in Iraq, Syria, and in Jerusalem. And the one that places him in his burial in Jerusalem places him in the tomb of the prophets with Zechariah and Haggai, because he was Malachi. And so I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but that is something that I read. Another person that we know of in this time period was Nehemiah. Like Ezra, he was born in exile and ended up returning to Jerusalem in 444 BC. He was an amazing, effective administrator who wisely avoided a lot of distractions that could have derailed the reconstruction effort on the wall around Jerusalem. There were a lot of distractions from those people, the people groups around them, trying to keep Jerusalem from being a walled city once again. And Nehemiah could have been very easily distracted, and instead he stays on task, doesn't let those things bother him, and he gets the wall built in 52 days. And after leading the Jews to once again follow the law of Moses, Nehemiah ends up returning to Persia for a period of time. We don't really know how long it is, but we do know that it was at least a year. We don't know exactly how long he was there. But when Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem to sort of check in on things, he finds that the people had reverted back to their old sinful ways, and this required Nehemiah to enact again the law of Moses. And so he's having to, rein them back in and get the Jews that have married non-Jews to get divorced and one thing and another. And so we don't know what happened to Nehemiah following his final visit to Jerusalem, and we don't even know where he is buried. Something interesting, if you look on your timeline there on the right-hand side, that box tells us that Nehemiah's return to Persia lasted more than a year, that he would return to serve as governor for a second time. And we know that his second term ended before 407 BC because there is an extra biblical source that records Bigvai as the governor of Judah in 407 BC. So we don't know how long before that Nehemiah was removed from office as governor, or if he died, or whatever the case may have been. But we do know that at 407 BC, he was no longer the governor. And so the dates that we have there for Nehemiah's, with most any of them, those dates are estimates given from different timelines as far as their lifespan. The next one that we have that would be a person of great interest would be Esther. And, Esther was raised by her uncle Mordecai in Susa. According to her age, she would, or according to some timelines that I saw, she would have been around 17 or 18 years old when she became queen of Persia. And so imagine that. The kingdom that I mentioned is 2.1 million square miles, and it's handed over to some degree to the queen, who is an 18-year-old girl. Crazy that, this is the way it works out, but that's how old she was, roughly. And her husband, King Xerxes, would have been about 41 at that point. And so she would have been 18, he would have been 41. Vashti was probably in her 30s. We don't know for certain, but 4 years after she became queen, so she's probably 21, 22 years old at this point, her uncle Mordecai offends the king's advisor Haman and sets in motion this genocidal plan to eradicate the Jewish people. And she bravely steps into the gap for the Jewish people with the king, and God uses her to bring deliverance to the Jews. Now, following the account of Esther that we have in the scriptures, her husband Xerxes I ruled for about 9 more years before he died. And so he died, and then Esther lived through the entire reign of Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, and into the reign of her husband's grandson, Artaxerxes II. And so she lived supposedly to about the age of 90, dying in Susa at the age of in the year 401 BC. She's also believed to be buried in a tomb in a place in Iran called Hamadan in Iran. And so we have a place that, if you ever were able to go to Iran, you could visit and see her tomb. But the last person that would be involved in this that we'd want to talk about is Mordecai. He's the uncle of Queen Esther, as we talked about, and the one responsible for raising her and developing her into the lady that she was. Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, and then that sets in motion that plan to get rid of all the Jews in Persia. And Mordecai, who had some favor with the king already for spoiling an assassination attempt, he also gets word of Haman's plan to eradicate the Jews. And so he shares it with Esther and encourages her, as for a time like this, for her to go and speak with the king. And Haman plans to execute Mordecai on those newly built gallows, and in turn, Haman is executed on them instead. Now, following Haman's execution, we know that Mordecai was elevated to Haman's position, and the king honored him. But after that, we don't know much about what happens to Mordecai following the events of the book of Esther. It's believed that he lived to be about the age of 80, dying in 430 BC, and he's believed to be buried in the same tomb in Hamadan, Iran, as his niece, Queen Esther. And so that's where they're believed. And there's a pretty lengthy tradition that's where they are buried. Now, as far as events that are occurring in the world at this point in time, in this part of the timeline, in 502 BC, there was a solar eclipse that darkened most of Egypt. Outside of that, in 490 BC, Persians and Greeks battle at Marathon, and following the Greek victory, a man named Phidippides ran 40 kilometers to announce the victory in Athens and dies after announcing it, and is the basis for today's modern long-distance marathon, hence the name Marathon. Not only that, in 480 BC, Spartan king Leonidas I and 300 Spartans die in defense of Greece at the Battle of Thermopylae. And so those are some events in world history that occur during the time that we've been looking at tonight. Now, as always, we're going to close out by looking at the timing of God's story in regards to what we've been looking at. Last time we talked about how God protected the line of promise during the exile, and this time we see how God returned the line of promise from exile back to Judea. Because during the exile and leading up to Cyrus's edict for the Jews to return to Judea, God maintained a faithful remnant in that exile. Individuals like Daniel and others, and we talked about them last time, how throughout the course of the exile, they didn't fall to the Babylonian pressures to conform to Babylonian culture and society and religion and all of that. And so they had been faithful up to the end of the exile not to fall prey to the Babylonian machine, if you want to call it that. But what we find is that after the exile and during this period of time that we've looked at tonight, that this remnant has continued to remain faithful to God as he moves them from exile in Babylon, Persia, back to Judea. And the faithful Jews continued to follow the law of Moses. These would have not been ones that Nehemiah would have had to reprimand when he came back for his second tour as governor in Judea. These would not have been ones that he would have had to force to divorce their Canaanite or non-Jew Gentile wives. And so, they kept themselves separate from this Persian world around them, whether it was in Susa or in those areas of Persia, or even when they come back to Judea. And despite Haman's attempts to eradicate the Jews, God used Esther to maintain the line of promise during her day. Because again, had Haman's plan happened, not only would the Jews have been eradicated, but so would have the line of promise. And so eventually, there are individuals that you read about in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke, people named like Risa, Eliakim, and Azer. They returned to Judea to bring about the fulfillment of messianic prophecies. Because those individuals, Risa, Eliakim, and Azer, they are in the line of David, coming from Abraham and all the way back to Adam, all the way to Mary and Joseph and to Jesus. And so they go from being in exile to returning to Jerusalem, and this helps to fulfill messianic prophecies. And you think about it, had they remained in Persia, the Messiah could not have fulfilled many of the Old Testament prophecies that were given about the Messiah, including his birth in Bethlehem in Judea, or Bethlehem Ephrathah, as we read in the book of Malachi. And so God orchestrated the exile of the Jews. He orchestrated it because of their idolatry and their sin and their refusal to worship him as they should according to the covenant that they had made. So he sends them into exile, and God had orchestrated that. But he also sovereignly orchestrated their return to Judea, whether it was immediately or whether it was decades later after they were given the opportunity. And so with the exiles returning to Judea, with the exiles that were returning to Judea was the line of promise that we've been following since Adam and Eve. This line of promise went back, and they eventually bring about the Messiah that had been promised for centuries and millennia at that point. Now, next time we'll see in the next time that we have this study in 2 weeks. We will be looking at the fulfillment of God's promise to bring about a Messiah to deliver not only Israel, but also the entire world. Because we skip over 400 years of world history because they do not apply short of trying to find the names and knowing the names of individuals from 400 BC to around 6 BC when Jesus is born. And so next time we're together, the timeline will involve the life and times of Jesus Christ. So that's where we'll be at next time. Are there any questions about tonight's study? Don't be playing that game, Joyce. That's when we're supposed to say you wasn't even here this morning, so you don't get to ask questions. I told him this morning, I said, we give Joyce a pass because she's getting to watch her granddaughter be baptized. So I was just trying to make sure everybody knew where you were at. They didn't say anything bad about you. Some of the pictures Joanne shared this morning didn't paint you in a great light, but no, I'm just picking. Guys, we had a great time on our trip. It was despite mechanical failures and a lot of odd things that just were unusual, as is per the usual with mission trips. We did have a great time, and our cooking team, those ladies did a fantastic job for us. They kept us well fed, and we had a good time. So. Outside of that, if there's not any questions about tonight's study, I'll close this out with a word of prayer. We'll be in Titus on Wednesday night, and next Sunday morning we'll be looking at the scripture verse for next week's Vacation Bible School. So with those things being shared, I'll close this with prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we come to you again tonight just grateful that you have given us your word to be able to help us understand not just the timeline of how world events and biblical events coincide, but Father, also the opportunity for us to read and study and understand how you have done everything and orchestrated everything up to this point in our study around the line of promise, even sending that line that the Messiah would come from into exile and then returning it to Jerusalem and to Judea. And so, Father, I pray that as we go forward from here, that we would continue to be students of your word, that we would study your word so that we can apply it to our lives and see how it impacts us on a daily basis. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.